Hi, everyone, and welcome back to IBKR Podcast. This is the second in the series of podcasts where we dig into history's greatest financial disasters, manias, and meltdowns. I'm your host, Jeff Praisman. I'm excited to combine my two passions, history and the markets. And today we're going to do a deep dive into one of the most spectacular financial catastrophes in human history, a story of greed, corruption, government collusion, and mass delusion that unfolded in early 18th century England, the South Sea Bubble. Buckle up, everyone, because this one has everything. Secret deals in smoke-filled rooms, lords and ladies gambling away their fortunes, a king who could barely speak English presiding over a nation losing its mind over stock prices, a company that never really did much of anything, and a crash so devastating that it nearly brought down the entire British government. Let's go back, way back, to the year 1711. To understand the South Sea Bubble, you have to understand the financial mess that Britain found herself in at the start of the 18th century. Britain had just spent over a decade fighting the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, expensive conflict that pitted Britain and its allies against France and Spain over who would sit on the Spanish throne. By the time the guns fell silent, Britain was drowning in debt. We're talking somewhere in the region of 35 to 45 million pounds in government debt. It was an almost incomprehensible sum at the time. Now, the government had a problem. It owed money to a huge number of individual creditors, army suppliers, contractors, merchants, many of whom have short-term government IOUs that were depreciating in value. The government really needed a way to consolidate this debt, make it manageable, and ideally make it disappear. Enter Robert Harley, who in 1711 became the Earl of Oxford and the Lord High Treasurer, and the man who was widely credited as the architect of the South Sea Company. Harley's idea was elegant, at least on paper. He thought, what if you created a joint stock company, a corporation, and transferred the government's debt into that company? Creditors would swap out their government IOUs for shares in a new company, and the government would pay the company a fixed annual sum as interest. And the company, in theory, would generate profits through trade that would make those shares valuable. So, the trade in question? Commerce with Spanish South America, a region then known as the South Seas. The idea was that Britain, having emerged from the war with a favorable peace treaty, would gain access to the fabulously wealthy Spanish colonies in South America. So gold, silver, exotic goods. The imagination of the investors ran wild. So, in 1711, the South Sea Company was born. But here's the first thing you need to know about the South Sea Company, and arguably the most important. It barely ever treated anything. Spanish weren't exactly thrilled, as you can imagine, about British merchants flooding their South American colonies. This peace treaty, the Treaty of Utrecht, was signed in 1713, and it did grant Britain the Asiana de Negros, which was a contract allowing Britain to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies per year for 30 years. This came out to about one ship per year. That's it. That's the trade empire that the investors were fantasizing about. And it gets worse for the South Sea Company. For much of its early existence, the company was at war. Britain and Spain went right back to fighting in 1718. So even that paltry trading right was suspended, and their South American assets were seized. The company sent a handful of trading voyages, made almost zero profit from the actual commerce, and spent most of its time doing what it had really been designed to do all along, financial engineering. But here's the thing about early 18th century investors. They didn't really necessarily care about what the company actually did. Honestly, I guess if they actually cared, they wouldn't invest in the slave trade to begin with. All they cared about was the story. And the South Sea Company had a much different story than they were selling to the public. Spanish gold, silver mines, exotic ports, treasure. The promoters of the companies were masterful at selling a vision, even if the reality was a near-empty shipping ledger. Does this sound familiar? Well, it should. The playbook, sell the dream, obscure the reality, is as old as markets themselves. Fun fact for everyone, in 1715, Lord Harley was accused of high treason and high crimes and misdemeanors, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Luckily for Harley, though, he escaped the hanging of the noose, was released in 1717, and lived a relatively private life until his death until 1724. Let's fast forward to 1719. The South Sea Company had been limping along for nearly a decade. It stocks trading, but not spectacularly. No surprise there, given the lack of fundamentals. Then something happened across the English Channel that changed everything. In France, John Law, a financial genius or a con artist, depending on your perspective, after being exiled from Scotland for killing a man in a duel, created the Mississippi Company. This was a similar scheme tied to the French colonial ambitions in North America. Law's scheme had sent French stock markets into the stratosphere. People were getting fabulously rich, or so it seemed. The word millionaire was actually coined during this period to describe the newly wealthy speculators in Paris. And the directors of the South Sea Company looked at what Law was doing and thought, why not? We can do this too. In January of 1720, the South Sea Company made an audacious proposal to the British government. They would take on the entire national debt, now standing at around £50 million, and convert it into South Sea Company stock. In exchange, the government would pay the company a fixed annual interest rate. The company would then sell new shares to the public, using the cash raised to pay off the debt holders and pocket whatever was left over. The company's directors knew the scheme only worked if the stock price went up, and up dramatically. So they set about making sure it would. They began bribing members of parliament, offering them shares at favorable prices in exchange for their support of the scheme. Several members of the cabinet received sweetheart deals, and there's even credible suggestions that the mistresses of King George were bribed with stock to win the king's favor. Parliament undoubtedly approved the scheme in April 1720, and the race was on. What happened next was one of the greatest speculative manias in history, and it moved fast. So in January 1720, the South Sea Company stock was trading around £128 per share. In February, it rose to £330, and by the end of May, it had crossed £550. By the end of June, this is just 6 months after the scheme was approved, it had reached nearly £1,000 per share. That's roughly an 8-fold increase in 6 months. The whole of London went mad. Aristocrats, merchants, clergymen, widows, servants, everyone and their neighbor was buying South Sea stock or trying to. Coffee houses became impromptu trading floors. Exchange Alley in the city of London was so packed with people trying to buy and sell shares that you could barely move. Women participated heavily in the market, which was notable for the time, and some even became significant traders. And it wasn't just a South Sea Company stock. This mania spawned hundreds of copycat companies, all trying to cash in on the public's appetite for speculation. These ventures ranged from the plausible to the completely absurd. There were companies formed to import walnut trees from Virginia, companies to manufacture a perpetual motion machine, companies to improve the art of making soap. One company, and this is my personal favorite, was described only as, quote, a company for carrying on an undertaking of a great advantage, but no one knows what it is, end quote. The promoter reportedly raised £2,000 in a single morning, then vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. Again, no surprise there, right? Parliament became alarmed by the proliferation of fraudulent schemes and passed the Bubble Act in June of 1720, which required joint stock companies to have a royal charter. The intent here was to partly suppress the competition and protect the South Sea Company's dominance, but it had the unintended effect of spooking investors and the cracks began to appear. The bubble began deflating in August of 1720, and it went fast. By September, it had burst catastrophically. The South Sea Company's director had been using a range of tricks to keep the stock price elevated. They were lending money to investors so they could buy more shares, essentially inflating demand artificially. They were spreading rumors of imminent dividends and trading profits that didn't exist. But then they could only keep the plate spinning in the air for so long. When a few major investors, including reportedly some of the company's own directors, who quietly sold their shares near the peak, began cashing out, confidence cracked. Selling begat more selling, and by the end of September 1720, the stock had collapsed back to around £150 per share, wiping out most of the gains of the previous months. The human cost was devastating. Thousands of families were ruined. People had mortgaged their homes, sold their lands, poured their life savings into South Sea stock, were left with almost nothing. The crisis spread to banking. Several major goldsmiths banks, which had lent heavily against the South Sea stock as collateral collapsed, credit froze, and the wider economy contracted sharply. Many notable people got burnt on this scheme, and among the notable casualties, Isaac Newton, yes, that's Sir Isaac Newton, who had actually sold his South Sea shares earlier at a profit, kept watching as prices kept rising, got back in near the peak, and lost an estimated 20,000 pounds, which is equivalent to several million pounds today. He reportedly said afterwards that he can calculate the movement of stars, but not the madness of men. Whether he actually said those exact words is disputed by historians, but the sentiment captures something true and timeless about human psychology and markets. When the dust settled, Parliament was furious, partly because many of its members had been complicit, and partly because the public was baying for blood. A parliamentary investigation was launched, and what was uncovered was a staggering web of corruption. The company's books had been falsified, shares had been allocated to fictitious names, and members of parliaments and government's ministers had received shares that had never actually been paid for. They were essentially gifts designed to buy their support. Several of the key figures faced severe consequences. For example, John Blunt, who was the driving force behind the scheme and the company's most aggressive promoter, was stripped of most of his fortune. He had accumulated somewhere around 183 pounds, which was a colossal sum back then. Parliament confiscated all but 1,000 pounds of it. James Cragg the Elder. He was a postmaster general who had been deeply involved in the bribery scheme. He actually died before he could be prosecuted, reportedly by suicide, though the circumstances were pretty murky. James Craggs the Younger. So Craggs were really all over this, as you can tell. He was the Secretary of State, and James Craggs, the elder's son, he also died of smallpox before facing justice. John Iselbaugh, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, essentially that's Britain's finance minister, he was expelled from Parliament and sent to the Tower of London. He was later released, retired to his Yorkshire estate, and spent his days designing what became one of England's most beautiful gardens at Studley Royal. So history is pretty strange with that guy. Even King George I's inner circle was implicated. Two of his German-born mistresses, nicknamed the Maypole and the Elephant by the English public, had received substantial shares as bribes. The king himself managed to avoid serious scrutiny, partly because investigating the monarch was, shall we say, politically complicated, to be polite. And the man who ultimately helped stabilize the situation was Robert Walpole. He was a Whig politician who warned against the scheme before it launched. He engineered a rescue plan that involved the Bank of England and the East India Company absorbing some of the South Sea Company's debt obligations. Walpole's handling of the crisis launched his political career into the stratosphere, and he would go on to become Britain's first de facto prime minister, holding power for over 2 decades. So, what do we take from all this? What does a financial catastrophe that happened over 300 years have to do with us and tell us? Actually, quite a lot. First of all, the power of narrative over fundamentals. The South Sea Company was at its core story. It was a vision of wealth that bore almost no relationship to the company's actual trading activities. Investors weren't buying the company, they were buying a dream. And we see this repeatedly through financial history. The dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, the housing bubble of 2000s, and more recently, the frenzies around certain meme stocks. Specific assets change, but the psychology doesn't. Second, regulatory capture and corruption. South Sea scheme succeeded in part because the people who should have been regulating it and scrutinizing it were in on the deal. Members of Parliament, government ministers, the King's own household all had financial incentives to look the other way. So when the gatekeepers are compromised, the gates don't hold. This is not a lesson that's aged out of relevance. Third, the madness of crowds. There is something in human psychology that makes us susceptible to feeling that this time is different. The old rules don't apply. The prices can rise forever. We're not like those other suckers who got burned. The South Sea bubble is a humbling reminder that those feelings are not a sign of insight. They're a warning sign. And finally, perhaps most poignantly, the South Sea bubble gave us one of the most important pieces of financial legislation in British history. The fallout from the crash contributed to a long period of caution and skepticism about joint stock companies that arguably slowed British financial development for decades. But it also planted the seeds of better financial regulation, more transparent markets, and a healthier skepticism of too good to be true investment schemes. The South Sea bubble lasted barely a year at its peak. The company itself, remarkably survived in a diminished form until about 1853, eventually becoming a little bit more than a vehicle for managing government debt, which, when you think about it, is what it really always was. The streets of Exchange Alley, where fortunes were made and lost in those frantic months of 1720, they still exist in the city of London today. You can walk them. They're narrow, a little shadowy. They're tucked between, now gleaming modern office towers. But if you know what happened there, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. Because the South Sea bubble is not just a historical curiosity, it's a mirror. Every generation gets its own version of the story. The names change, the technology changes, the asset changes, but the human drama at the heart of it, the hope, the greed, the denial, the reckoning, that stays the same. Folks, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the South Sea bubble, please check out my podcast, The Tulip Bubble, When Flowers Cost More Than Houses. Leave a review and share it with someone you think might benefit from a little financial history. Next episode, we'll look into another spectacular collapse. Stay tuned.